Well, you are locked on to the SA Today desk, and our question of the day, it's a crucial weekend for South African football. It all started last night when Japan thrashed Botswana 6-0 at the 2018 FIFA Women's World Cup taking place in Uruguay. Well, this afternoon, Bafana take on their arch-rival Nigeria in the 2019 Africa Cup of Nations qualifier at the FNB Stadium. On Sunday, Banyana opens their Group B African Cup of Nations against Nigeria in Ghana. Well, do send us your thoughts on the performance of the South African national football teams. That's at SA_SABC, and we will read them on the show. Well, African foreign heads of state and government are currently meeting at the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia. This meeting will consider reform proposals for the continental body. Well, the reform document was compiled by the current AU chairperson and Rwandan President Paul Kagame with the assistance of eminent persons from the continent that include, among others, South Africa's Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. President Cyril Ramaphosa is also among the leaders attending that meeting. Our correspondent, that's Coletta Wanjohi, is there. Good afternoon, Coletta. Welcome to the SA Today desk. A crucial weekend now as we see President Paul Kagame really seeing through his last push on AU reforms to cement his legacy as AU chairperson.
Well, yes, as you've said, actually the meeting is going on right now. It is a legacy that President Kagame wants to leave, one of a better African Union, one of a stronger continent. And this is something that came out during his speech today when he said the journey has begun, and it has begun well, because we've seen African leaders really progressing in terms of contributing to the reforms that the government or the different governments should go towards in terms of the continental body. And one of the issues that they've been talking about is about reforms of the leadership of the African Union Commission. And that means that they'll have to strategize and redefine the roles and duties of the different members of the Commission, starting from the chairperson up to the lowest level. Also, we are expecting that the heads of state will decide whether they will want to have a deputy commissioner who is appointed by the African Union chairperson, as opposed to having countries campaign to have their people within the commissions. At the end of the day, they are also going to be discussing about how to finance the African Union so that we have 100% or full financing from the continent itself. So it is going to be a very full of 2 days full of work. And as the presidents continue to meet in the plenary hall just behind me here, we're expecting that by the end of tomorrow they will come up with tangible reasons or tangible reforms that they'll be able to implement. And President Cyril Ramaphosa is also here, and he has already voiced his concern and saying that South Africa fully supports the reforms that the African Union is planning to institute.
Coletta, just on that point of proposed self-financing, alternative financing for the AU, that's going to come up, of course. And we did hear a lot about this in previous sessions and other summits where member states were encouraged to fully finance 100% of the operating budget. But one starts to wonder how realistic this is right now, as more than 60% of the overall budget of the AU is paid by external partners, we know, and the collection of 30% or less is from member states, and more than 30 member states are currently indebted to the OU. Is this perhaps being overly ambitious for now, and will we see some kind of follow-up talks on the level of implementation and agreement on the scale of assessment to implementing the financing from member states?
Well, it is not really overambitious, because it has been shown, or it has practically been shown, that it can be done. It can be done because depending on the mathematics that has been done, if each and every member state at least gives one item, either a good or a service, and levies 0.2% of imports on that good or service, then we are going to, and if that money comes back to the African Union Commission or the African Union running or budget, then we shall be able to finance 100%. The issue here is just commitment. And it all begins with political will. And that's what we had heads of state here speaking today and saying that The reforms are beautiful. The implementation is something that can be done. But at the end of the day, it is about the political will. If the heads of state do not stand in and say we can do this and mobilize this within the national government, then it's not going to happen. But it is feasible. It can really happen.
Coletta, there's strong focus in recent years at the African Union Commission on human rights and rights of women specifically. And it becomes unsettling when we see such strong European solidarity in the aftermath of what comes to mind, the Paris terror attack, for example, where more than 3 million people were on the march in Europe. But in Africa, we have scores killed, maimed, kidnapped, raped every day of every week in acts of terror. And there's such a glaring absence or lack of global and regional solidarity when it comes to these atrocities on the continent and when it comes to protecting human rights in Africa. Will we see a closer look at effective implementation of key tools like the AU human rights and governance tools like the African Charter on Human and People's Rights or the African Charter on Election and Democracy and Good Governance, which is still lacking for member states at this juncture?
Well, that is part of the reforms or the recommendation that President Paul Kagame has put up as issues that need to be changed. For example, he has said that the African Union has institutions that are supposed to provide justice, that are supposed to oversee human rights respect in the continent. But the problem is these institutions are there, but member states have not ratified. We don't have the enough number of ratifications for each of these judicial systems or human rights institutions to be able to really defend the citizens. So what the reforms are saying is that we need to ratify, we need all the members to ratify the implementation of these institutions. We've got courts of justice, we've got the African human rights on peoples and human rights, the courts on people and human rights. If all the member states ratify the implementation or the operationalization of these institutions, then it will be easy for Africa to speak and also walk the talk. But as long as the heads of state do not ratify, do not push their countries to understand the importance of having these continental bodies that will respect human rights, then at the end of the day, it will just be talk like has happened so many years ago. So what the reforms is saying that Africa has the capacity. We do not need to look beyond Africa to seek justice, to seek advice on how to institute human rights in the continent. We've got the expertise here, and the reforms or the reform agenda is saying that let Africa tap into its own internal expertise in terms of providing justice, in terms of upholding human rights, and with that should come by African heads of states ratifying the institutions or implementation of the institutions that really can help them walk the talk.
Coletta, a recent independent study showed us that from a few years ago that less than 10% of the decisions taken by the African Union are fully implemented. Surely the AU now has its work cut out in terms of working on its credibility and correcting perhaps what is a misinformed perception out there that it's actually a toothless tool on the continent.
Well, that's a big issue, and at the end of the day, it's about so many other resolutions that have been passed by the African Union's Assembly and have not been resolved. That is just one particular issue, but President Kagame in his report said there are about 1,500 resolutions that the AU Assembly has passed over time. So the fact that we're seeing member states really ratifying and trying to implement some of the resolutions is a good thing, but we still have hundreds more that the AU Assembly has over the years past. He is saying that the African Union now needs to prioritize and probably during each summit only have three items on the agenda, that it should really just focus on instead of having so many things that has been happening. And also the reforms say that if the African Union Assembly decide that they will only have one summit in January here in Addis Ababa, then for the rest of in July, instead of coming back to Addis Ababa as a group, then each of the member states, depending on which regional bloc they subscribe to, they should have summits in their regional blocks, and at the end of the day then come back and feed into the AU Assembly at the end of the year. So if all these things happen, we are going to see more ratifications, we are going to see more implementations of resolutions, and probably we shall reduce that backlog of about over 1,000 that have not been looked into. So it is more than just one issue that has been implemented by heads of state. It is a good example, it is progress, but still more needs to be done.
Coletta Wanjohi joining us from Addis Ababa there in Ethiopia, where the AU summit is currently rolling out. She'll be bringing us regular updates across the afternoon, so do stay locked on to the SABC News channel.